Welcome back, everyone. So today's deep dive, it's Venus.
Yeah.
And, you probably have an image in your head, but believe me, the Roman version, it's huge, way bigger than you think.
Yeah, when most people hear Venus, they think, okay, love, beauty, maybe that painting with the seashell, right? Classical marble.
Yeah.
But that's honestly just scratching the surface for the Romans. She wasn't just about desire or, sex. She was this incredibly dynamic force. Fertility, definitely, but also prosperity. And this is the kicker, victory, military victory.
She really was sort of the engine room for Roman society, wasn't she? I mean, our sources show her operating everywhere.
Absolutely.
So the mission for us today, for you listening, is to unpack this. How does one goddess end up being the divine ancestor for all Romans, and at the same time, the patron deity for the city's main sewer line?
It seems impossible.
Yeah.
We need to look at how she absorbed Greek myths, her deeply contradictory roles, and how she got used politically. And that contradiction is so important for understanding her political power. She wasn't some minor figure. She was absolutely central, part of the Dia Consentes, the top 12 gods.
The A-list.
The A-list, exactly. But even more fundamentally, she was the mythical mother of the entire Roman people through Aeneas, the Trojan hero who supposedly founded the line.
And this wasn't just some dusty old story for them, was it? This ancestry thing was real political capital.
Oh, absolutely. Living, breathing political currency. You've got Julius Caesar, loud and clear, claiming Venus as his direct divine ancestor.
Right.
He used her favor very publicly to justify his wars, his power grabs, basically everything he did. It was a massive part of his propaganda.
That political angle is crucial, but we do need to remember the Greek connection, don't we? Because it's impossible to ignore.
You really can't separate them entirely. The Romans were master adapters. They took a lot of the key stories, and maybe more importantly, the visual look, the iconography straight from Aphrodite, her Greek counterpart.
Which is why we picture her the way we do.
Exactly. That common Western image, often nude, classically beautiful, that is Venus, but it's Venus filtered through Aphrodite. The Roman pantheon was incredibly good at absorbing other gods, and Venus is maybe the prime example of that process.
Yeah.
Wholesale adoption and adaptation.
Okay, so let's try to unpack that core identity then. If we peel back the Greek layers for a second, what's in the name? What did Romans think Venus was originally, before all the Aphrodite stuff?
Right, you have to go down to the roots, the linguistics. And that's where you see the raw concept of desire itself.
Okay.
So the Latin word Venus, the common noun, meaning love or charm, and the goddess Venus, the proper noun, they both come from this Proto-Italic root, Venos. And Venos just means desire.
So it's not just personifying attraction, it's like
Yeah.
the force itself, the actual tribe.
Precisely. That's the idea. And you can trace it even further back to Proto-Indo-European. There's a root, wena, which seems to mean something like to strive for, to wish for, to desire, to love. So at her absolute core, Venus is that striving impulse, the energy that makes beings seek things out, want things, achieve things.
And you can see that idea branching out in Latin, right? Like related words.
Yeah, it ripples through the language. From that same root, you get venustus, meaning charming or attractive.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Sure.
You get the verb venerar, to adore, to revere, to honor. That's our word venerate.
Okay.
But it also connects to more a practical striving, like veneia, which means favor or permission, something you have to work to get.
Right, you strive for favor.
Exactly. And even voner, which means to hunt. Again, an active pursuit. All these words have that sense of reaching out, actively engaging to get something valuable.
Okay, now here's where my notes got really interesting and honestly a bit dark. You mentioned the root Venus and its connection to venom.
Poison, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a startling connection, isn't it? But it tells you so much about how the Romans viewed desire. Linguistically, venom seems to come from an older form, venas, and that didn't originally mean deadly poison. It meant love drink, or addicting substance, or magic filter, magic potion.
So it's a love potion. The root of desire is also the root of love potion, which then becomes poison.
Exactly. It suggests the Romans understood that raw, striving desire, the essence of Venus, wasn't just gentle charm. It was also this powerful, intoxicating force, a kind of drug.
Wow. So the same energy that creates affection could also lead to, like, dangerous obsession, addiction, even destruction.
That seems to be the implication. The concept holds both, the pure attraction and the potentially toxic, addictive side of wanting something too much. It perfectly sets up her original Roman character, described sometimes as ill-defined, very assimilative, a native goddess, whose cults maybe represented the legitimate side of divine charm and seduction, different from the very formal contract-like relationships you had with, say, Jupiter or Juno.
So if she's this fundamental force of desire, where did Roman theology place her in the grand scheme of things? She wasn't just, flitting around causing trouble. She had a cosmic role.
Oh, absolutely essential. Especially in the views of thinkers like Varro, they saw Venus as vital for cosmic balance, for generation itself. She represented the yielding principle. Watery, female.
Okay.
Yielding, receptive. Necessary to receive, absorb, and crucially temper the active, fiery male principle. Think Mars, think Vulcan.
Ah, so she wasn't just, married to Mars or Vulcan in the myths. She was the necessary medium that allowed their fiery energy to become productive instead of just destructive.
That's a great way to put it. Without the water, the fire just burns out or destroys. She unites these opposites, fire and water, male and female, in mutual affection, as they put it. That's what allows fertility, life, generation.
Okay, that makes sense theologically. And then does that translate down into everyday life beyond the big cosmic picture?
It does. You see it in domestic rituals, even though technically Juno was the goddess of lawful marriage, the contract.
Right, like prospective brides giving Venus a gift before the wedding.
Exactly. That points towards preparing for the pleasurable, the generative aspects of marriage. Juno handles the legal side. Venus handles the connection, the desire within it.
Makes sense. And what about girls coming of age?
Yes, there's that lovely tradition of girls dedicating their childhood toys to Venus, or sometimes to the Lares, the household gods, when they reached puberty.
Sort of marking a transition.
Clearly marking a transition out of girlhood and into the world of potential adult roles, marriage, motherhood, attraction, stepping into the realm of Venus, of desire.
And just to show how deep this idea ran, the dice game, knuckle bones.
Yes. She was the jackpot.
Literally.
The best possible throw you could get in knucklebones was called Venus. Sometimes Basilicus, the kingly throw.
And getting that roll gave you power.
It did. If you rolled a Venus, you got to appoint the king of the feast for the gathering. Basically, temporary social ruler, deciding how much everyone drank, that sort of thing. So she's tied directly to luck, social favor, winning.
Okay, this brings up a big question then. How does one goddess do all this? Cosmic balancer, ancestor, dice game champion, love, poison. How did she manage such a, frankly, contradictory portfolio?
That's where the epithets really come into play. The Romans had this religious idea, nomen omen, where a name reveals the essence or can even create a connection. So through folk etymologies and just sheer need, they gave Venus countless descriptive titles, epithets, that let her splinter off and absorb almost any role.
And some of these epithets lead to some really strange forms of Venus, right?
Oh, absolutely. Some are deeply weird and challenge everything we think we know. We have to start with maybe the most startling one. Venus Marbata, the bearded Venus.
Bearded Venus, that just sounds wrong.
Yeah.
We picture perfect female beauty, and here's a version attested in Cyprus, apparently shown with a beard, and male genitalia.
Male genitalia, yes. But still with female clothing and a generally female figure, it's this incredible synthesis of gender opposites.
Why? What was the point?
It might reflect a much older pre-classical idea, maybe a primordial fertility deity who was self-sufficient, containing both principles. And the worship reflected the rituals involved cross-dressing. Men wore women's clothes, women wore men's clothes.
Cross-dressing? Again, why? Symbolism.
Probably a ritual way to embrace the full spectrum of life-giving power, going beyond normal gender limits to connect with that complete, balanced divine force. And sometimes this Venus Barbata was shown doing the Anacermene.
Okay, remind me that's the ritual exposure.
Exactly. Pulling up the clothes to reveal the genitals in this case. The male genitals attributed to her.
Which is usually about warding off evil.
Right.
Apotropaic magic, not seduction.
Precisely. It's about raw protective power through this shocking display of combined life force, a world away from the shy Venus Pudica type.
Totally different. Okay, what about Venus Calva? Venus the bald one. That's another strange one for a beauty goddess.
Right. The sources we have explaining this are later post-classical, but they offer two main stories. One is super patriotic. It says that during a really desperate siege, Roman matrons cut off their long hair, a symbol of virtue, so the army could use it to make bowstrings.
Wow, okay, so Venus becomes linked to sacrifice for the state.
Exactly. Selfless military devotion. The other story is more about community health.
How so?
It suggests women sacrificed their hair to Venus, hoping she'd restore hair that others had lost during some kind of epidemic or plague. So again, it shifts her from personal charm to communal protection and healing.
Okay, so from hair loss and war Let's make the jump to plumbing, because this feels quintessentially Roman. Venus Cloacina, Venus the Purifier.
Yes. Here she merges with an old Etruscan water goddess, Cloacina. And Cloacina had this ancient shrine right over the outlet of the Cloaca Maxima.
Rome's main sewer. The big one.
The really big, notoriously smelly one. And the rites performed at Venus Cloacina's shrine were just fundamentally practical. They were meant to purify the sewer water and, crucially, the toxic air, the miasma, coming from it.
It takes a certain kind of genius to assign your goddess of beauty the job of cleaning out the main sewer line. She's literally purifying the city's waste.
But they connected that physical cleansing to a kind of moral or social cleansing, too. Some traditions say Venus Cloacina also protected and purified sex within marriage.
Ah, so cleansing the waters, cleansing the act itself, keeping it sort of clean within social rules.
That seems to be the idea, purifying of both the physical environment and the social sexual environment.
Okay, then building on her birth from the sea foam, the Greek connection, Aphrodite, she obviously gets sea-related titles, too.
Naturally. She becomes Venus Eploia of the fair voyage and Venus Pontia of the sea. Patron saint of sailors, basically.
Makes sense.
Credited with calming the waves. And the statues or images dedicated to her in these roles often show her with dolphins or wearing diadems, maybe with carved veils that look like waves or sea spray. Clear maritime symbols.
Then there's a quick mention of Venus Mercia. That sounds a bit more obscure.
It is. Seems to be a merger with a very local, probably minor deity named Mercia, associated with the myrtle tree, which is a huge symbol for Venus.
Right, we'll get back to the myrtle.
And a shrine down in the Circus Maximus area. Really, it's just another example of Venus absorbing local spirits, although Christian writers later picked up on Mercia and twisted it to mean sloth or laziness, probably to slander Venus by linking her myrtle, symbolizing pleasure, to idleness.
Okay, deliberate distortion. Now let's get to the really high-stakes political stuff. The epithets that shaped the Roman Republic's collapse and the rise of the empire. Starting with Venus Victrix. Venus the Victorious.
This is her as a war goddess, straight up. It's a Roman take on the armed Aphrodite idea, which itself goes back to Middle Eastern goddesses like Ishtar, who were goddesses of both love and war. Venus Victrix was the one who delivered victory on the battlefield.
And the big political players fought to claim her patronage, didn't they? Like Pompey.
Fiercely. Pompey the Great wanted to associate his successes with her, maybe trying to outdo his rival Sulla. So in 55 BC, he builds this incredible, lavish theater complex in Rome.
Right, Pompey's theater.
And dedicates the temple at the very top of it to Venus Victrix. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a massive public statement. My victories come from Venus.
Claiming her was like claiming divine right to conquer.
Pretty much, predestined success. And Sulla, the dictator before Pompey, had already done something similar. He adopted Venus Felix, Lucky Venus, as part of his name.
Felix means lucky or fortunate, so that's blending Venus's charm with, like, Fortuna's good luck.
Exactly. Sulla explicitly attributed his military and political success to her favor, her good fortune.
And this idea of Venus guaranteeing Rome's luck and destiny continued later, right? With emperors like Hadrian.
Definitely. Hadrian built that enormous temple of Venus Felix at Roma Eterna, Lucky Venus, and Eternal Rome right in the Forum, physically linking her fortune to the everlasting fate of the city itself.
Okay, and that brings us to the most politically charged one of all. Venus Genitrix, Venus the Mother.
This is the big one, especially for the end of the Republic. It cemented her role as the goddess of motherhood, yes, and domesticity, but crucially as the personal ancestor of the Julian family Caesar's family line.
And by extension, the ancestor of all Romans, tying everyone's origins back to her through the Julians.
Precisely. It provided this mythic, divine mandate for the Julian clan's prominence. And Julius Caesar's use of Venus Gentrix was absolutely revolutionary.
Okay, let's dive into that history, because this is where piety and power politics just completely merge.
Yeah.
The actual development of her cults is tangled up with war, political ambition, and even, like, controlling people's behavior.
It really is. You can see it right from her first major temple dedication in Rome back in 295 BC. It was vowed during the Third Samnite War, a major conflict.
And dedicated to Venus obsequens, meaning...
Indulgent Venus, or maybe favorable Venus. But get this. The temple was supposedly paid for entirely with money collected from fines. Fines imposed on Roman noblewomen found guilty of adultery.
Wait, seriously? The temple to the goddess of love and desire was funded by punishing women for illicit desire.
That's the tradition. It's a perfect early example of the Romans using her cult to enforce social norms, channeling desire into approved paths while punishing the unapproved.
Wow. Okay, but the really big strategic move with Venus came later, during the Second Punic War, right after that terrible defeat at Lake Trasimene.
Yeah, 217 BC, Rome was in deep crisis, desperate for any divine edge against Hannibal and Carthage. They consulted the Sibylline books, the Oracle.
And the Oracle gave some very specific, very strategic advice.
It did. The Oracle basically said Rome could turn the tide against Carthage if they could persuade a particular statue of Venus to switch sides. This was the statue of Venus Erycina, worshipped on Mount Eryx in Sicily.
And she was the patron goddess of Carthage's allies in Sicily.
Exactly. So when the Romans eventually conquered that part of Sicily, they didn't just loot the statue. They performed this elaborate ritual, essentially inviting the goddess to come to Rome. They captured her image, brought it back, and installed it right on the Capitoline Hill, making her one of the Dei Incentus.
And they framed this not as stealing an enemy god, but as what? A homecoming?
A homecoming. They spun it as bringing an ancestral goddess back to her rightful place, and they strategically identified this imported Venus Erycina with their own Venus Genitrix, the ancestor.
That is brilliant political maneuvering. You simultaneously weaken your enemy's divine support and bolster your own claim to ancient divine origins, all linked to victory.
It was genius. It retroactively cemented Venus's support for Rome's destiny, tying it all back to Aeneas and Troy.
But they didn't just have this one high-status, politically useful version of Erycina, did they? They had to manage the, let's say, less respectable aspects of her original cult, too.
They did.
Yeah.
And you can see a clear class distinction in how they handled it. They established a second, separate temple for the original Erycine form, the one more associated with fertility rites, and, let's be frank, with prostitutes and courtesans.
Where did they put this second temple?
Significantly outside the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city proper, near the Colline Gate. This location, established in Haldod 81 BC, was deemed okay for common girls and sex workers. It kept the more popular, maybe rowdier fertility aspects separate from the state cult on the Capitoline.
That compartmentalization is so typically Roman. You've got the dignified, aristocratic Venus Genitrix for the Senate and official ceremonies.
Right.
And then the more accessible, commercial, maybe slightly wilder Venus Erycina outside the walls for everyone else.
And that kind of dual approach, claiming the high ground while managing the popular elements, really set the stage for figures like Sulla and Pompey later on. Sulla claiming Felix, Lucky. Pompey building his massive theater for Victrix, Victoriouses. They were competing for her top-tier patronage.
But Caesar took it even further, didn't he? He wasn't just claiming Victrix for his wars. He doubled down on Genitrix, the ancestor.
He made it personal, and deeply political. His dedication of the Temple of Venus Genitrix in 46 BC, right in the middle of his massive 4-day triumph celebration, that was a statement.
A huge statement.
He was taking what was essentially his family's private ancestral cult, the Julian lineage, and elevating it to a major state religion. He was weaving his own bloodline directly into the divine fabric of Rome itself.
That must have felt incredibly bold, maybe even blasphemous to some traditionalists, pushing your family goddess out of the whole state.
Oh, it was audacious. And while Caesar's power at that moment probably squashed most open criticism, it definitely blurred the lines between public religion and private ambition in a way that hadn't been done before, linking his military triumph directly to his divine ancestry through Venus Genitrix. That was a powerful message.
And a message that his heir, Augustus, picked up and ran with, right?
Yeah.
Using Venus to legitimize the whole imperial system.
Absolutely. It became a cornerstone of imperial legitimacy.
Okay, let's shift to the rhythm of her worship, the festivals. April was her month. Mensis Aprilis.
Right. And the Romans, loving their etymologies, linked Aprilis to the verb aperire, to open, thinking of spring, blossoms opening, fertility opening up.
Makes sense.
And her influence was so pervasive culturally that when the Romans were mapping their gods onto Germanic ones, the Interpretatio Romana, they identified Venus with the goddess Friho. And that's how we get Friday. Dies Veneris, Venus's day.
Wow, okay. So the big festival in April was the Veneralia on April 1st, dedicated to Venus Verticordia, changer of hearts. This sounds like it had a very specific social purpose.
It absolutely did. This cult seems to have been established around 220 BC, specifically as a form of, well, moral correction.
Like social engineering.
Pretty much. Its job was to address sexual offenses among Romans, including, significantly, scandals involving the Vestal virgins. These were seen as polluting the state and potentially angering the gods, especially during the stress of the Punic Wars.
So Venus Verticordia's mission was to take that raw, potentially disruptive energy of libido, untamed desire,
Yeah.
and transform it, turn the heart towards pudicitia, which is like proper sexual conduct within marriage and socially approved boundaries.
Exactly, channeling desire into virtue. And the ritual itself is fascinating. They take her statue from her temple
Okay.
and carry it to the men's public baths, which is a really unusual setting for a ritual focused on female virtue.
Why the men's packs? That seems odd.
It's striking, isn't it? Maybe it was about public visibility, a reminder to the men as well, but there, female attendants would undress the statue, wash it carefully with warm water, and then redress it and garland it with myrtle. The whole process symbolized purification and transformation, cleansing desire, making it proper again.
A very physical enactment of moral change. Okay, then later in April the 23rd, we have the Venalia Urbana, a wine festival shared with Jupiter.
Yes, and here, Venus's role was specific. She was the patron of profane wine.
Meaning everyday wine, not the super sacred stuff.
Exactly. The wine for daily human consumption, for social enjoyment. And this festival really highlights her connection back to those common girls and prostitutes associated with that temple near the Colon Gate.
The one outside the sacred boundary.
That's the one. They'd gather there for the Venalia Urbana, and they'd offer her specific things. Myrtle, mint, and rushes, often bundled up inside bunches of roses.
And what were they asking for in return?
Their prayers were beautifully practical and personal. They asked Venus for beauty and popular favor, and specifically to be made charming and witty.
That's brilliant. So help me be attractive, well-liked, and good at conversation.
Basically, yes. It shows Venus was the go-to goddess for anyone, regardless of class, trying to get ahead using charm and social skills. Not just for emperors, but for sex workers, too.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to architecture. Even the famous architect Vitruvius had opinions on where you should build a temple for Venus based on moral concerns.
He did. He actually recommended placing temples dedicated to Venus near the city gates.
Why the gates?
His reasoning was to keep the influence of lust somewhat contained, preventing it from spreading too deeply into the city proper, kind of quarantining desire architecturally. He also thought the slender, elegant Corinthian style of columns suited her character best.
But he wasn't a fan of Caesar's big temple of Venus Genetrix, was he? Architecturally.
No, he had some sharp criticisms. He disliked that it was built in the Pycnostellos style.
Pycno what now?
Pycnostellos. It just means the columns are set very close together. Densely spaced, thick-set columns. Vitruvius thought this was completely wrong for Venus Genetrix.
Why? What was wrong with closely spaced columns for the divine ancestor?
Two main problems, according to Vitruvius. First, the dense columns made the temple interior too dark and gloomy, which he felt didn't suit Venus's bright, life-giving nature.
Okay, aesthetics.
But second, and maybe more damningly from a social perspective, the columns were so close together that Roman matrons couldn't walk into the temple arm in arm as was customary. They were forced to enter in single file.
Seriously. That was his complaint.
Yes. For the temple of the ultimate mother goddess, the ancestor of Rome, forcing respectable married women to break rank and file in singly, that was a failure of design that disrespected both the goddess and the matrons. It violated social decorum.
That tiny detail says so much about Roman priorities. Social order, appearance, even in temple design. Okay, so if we pull all this together, Venus wasn't just an abstract idea. She shaped how Romans understood desire, how they depicted it, controlled it, used it across art, myth, politics, everything.
Completely. And her mythology, especially around her children, explores the different flavors of desire. You have Cupid often representing raw lust, imperious desire, and then Amor representing more affectionate, kindly love. And their father could be Mars or Vulcan or even Mercury, depending on the story.
Yeah.
The paternity was flexible.
And we see the danger of that unchecked Cupid figure very clearly in the Aeneid, Rome's foundational epic.
Absolutely. Venus sends Cupid, disguised as Aeneas' young son Ascanius, to deliberately make Queen Dido fall madly in love with Aeneas. He uses his arrows, his power.
And that manipulation leads directly to disaster.
Directly. Dido breaks her vows to her dead husband, loses her kingdom, commits suicide, and lays a curse on Aeneas and his descendants, the future Romans. It's a powerful mythological warning about desire used as a weapon, echoing that venom, that poison connection from the etymology.
It seems like the Romans themselves, or at least their poets, recognized this distinction. They often preferred the term amor when talking about more socially acceptable reciprocal love, right? Even though the official cult formula Venus Cupidoque, Venus and Cupid existed.
Yeah, amor felt safer, perhaps. Kinder, less like the destructive force Cupid could represent. Now, thinking about her symbols, myrtle is number one. Myrtus.
Along with roses.
Along with roses, yes. Myrtle was considered an aphrodisiac. It was woven into bridal bouquets. Worshippers wore it at her festivals. It was everywhere associated with her.
And that myrtle connection is what helped bridge the gap between Venus and that Etruscan water goddess Cloacina, right? Turning pollution into purification.
It seems so. Myrtle itself was used in some purification rituals, so its symbolism was flexible from desire and aphrodisiac qualities to cleansing and purification. It helped knit those seemingly opposite roles together in Venus Cloacina.
And of course, wine. Can't forget the wine.
Never forget the wine with Venus, that famous proverb, sine cere et baccho frigit Venus. Without Ceres food and Bacchus wine, Venus freezes.
Basically, you need food and booze to get things going.
Pretty much. It acknowledges the basic physical, social lubrication needed for desire and interaction. And festivals like the Venalia celebrated that essential profane wine she governed.
But there's a place where Venus and her symbols like myrtle were completely banned. A total exclusion zone.
Yes, the rites of Bona Dea, the good goddess. A deity exclusively for women, focused on female chastity and fertility, but in a very different mode from Venus.
And in Bona Dea's rites, Venus was unmentionable. Myrtle was forbidden. Anything male was forbidden.
Absolutely taboo, complete exclusion. It's a fascinating contrast.
Why? If both are linked to fertility in some way.
Because Bona Dea's rites seem to have been about creating a space of pure female power and pudicitia, chastity, completely shielded from male influence, and therefore shielded from the potentially untamed libido that Venus represented. It was a different kind of fertility, perhaps more controlled, more exclusively female.
So Venus represented a desire that involved interaction, maybe risk, while Bona Dea was about contained female power.
That could be one way to look at it. Interestingly, women could drink wine at Bona Dea's rites, even strong wine, but they had to call it honey.
A euphemism.
A deliberate euphemism. By calling it honey, they made it ritually pure, safe, virtuously drunk, untainted by Bacchus or by Venus's association with worldly desire.
That is intricate. Okay, finally, let's look at her image in art history. Pompeii gives us different flavors of Venus.
It does. You find the very formal Venus Pompeiana fully dressed, standing rigidly, often holding symbols of power usually placed in the more public spaces of a house, like the atrium or reception rooms.
Making a statement about the household status.
Probably. But then in more private areas, like gardens or dining rooms, you might find the Venus Pescatrix, Venus the fisherwoman, much more playful, maybe semi-nude, seated, holding a fishing rod, more relaxed, domestic.
And then the big same as statues, the classical tradition.
Yeah.
That mostly follows one Greek model, right?
Largely, yes. The Aphrodite of Cnidus by Praxiteles was hugely influential. That set the standard for the idealized female nude. Variants like the Venus de Milo, the Capitoline Venus, the Medici Venus, they all riff on that basic type.
Which is why, even today, we tend to call almost any classical female nude statue a Venus.
Exactly. Even if the original subject might have been a portrait of a real woman or another goddess entirely, Venus became shorthand for beautiful, classical nude female figure.
And that carried straight into the Renaissance. It made nudity acceptable.
It definitely helped. Artists and patrons could justify depicting beautiful, sometimes quite erotic, nude figures by labeling them Venus. It was classical, therefore inherently artistic and acceptable, not just titillating. It gave nudity an artistic alibi.
Which led to Venus just becoming a general term for any painting or statue of a nude woman.
Pretty much. And then you get the modern, slightly ironic usage when archaeologists talk about the Paleolithic Venus figurines.
Right. Those very old, often very heavy-set, clearly fertility-focused figures.
Yeah. Calling them Venus figurines creates this deliberate contrast between the ancient, earthy focus on sheer fertility and the later classical Greek and Roman ideal of aesthetic beauty and charm. It highlights how the concept evolved.
What a journey. We've gone from the root of her name, linking desire and danger, charm and poison, all the way through Venus the victorious general, Venus the ancestor mother, Venus the sewer cleaner, Venus the bearded paradox. She really did absorb everything, the most contradictory, adaptable figure imaginable.
She really was, and her story, her evolution, it's just a perfect illustration of how societies shape their gods to fit their needs. Did they need political legitimacy? Call on Venus Genetrix. Did they need military luck? create a Venus Felix or Victrix? Did they need to reinforce social morals about sex? Establish a cult to Venus Verticordia? She reflected all aspects of Roman desire, high, low, political, personal, practical.
And crucially, she was seen as the one who balanced those fundamental opposites, right? The watery female, the fiery male. Without her, the whole system was out of whack.
That balance, that union of opposites through her, was absolutely essential for generation, for order, for the cosmos to function productively in their view. Excess of either principle was dangerous.
So here's something to think about then.
Yeah.
Given that Venus was so vital for uniting these necessary contradictions, fire and water, male and female, desire and order, and that imbalance was seen as destructive, what fills that role today? What concept or force, or maybe even technology, acts as that ultimate assimilator in our world, trying to balance out our own contradictory essential human drives? What, if anything, stands where Venus stood, mediating desire and destiny?
That's a great question to ponder.
Definitely something to think about as you reflect on this deep dive into the multifaceted world of Venus. Thanks for exploring these complex sources with us today.